Hi class, it's Amanda, and here's my case presentation. So first, for my agency overview, I intern at True Community Care, which is a nonprofit hospice in Boulder County. True also offers palliative care services, PACE, and grief services. Well, we all work as a part of an interdisciplinary team with each patient, meaning that there's social workers, doctors, nurses, CNAs, volunteers, everybody wraps around the patient and family. And usually a social worker will visit 1 to 2 times per month or as needed, unless this is otherwise indicated in the patient's care plan as a specific need. So does the patient need more socialization? Does the family need more information on anticipatory grief and just the hospice philosophy? On the other end of that, patients or families can also completely decline social work visits, and that's okay too. Some context about the agency, which have come to light in something that I've never really thought about before this year, is that True receives a lot of federal funding through the Medicare hospice benefit. So there's a little bit of a gray area between federal law and state law, especially laws like the Colorado End of Life Options Act, which is a medical aid in dying law, the use of medical marijuana as treatment, or even just recreational marijuana. There's a lot of gray areas, and it's kind of weird, and there are things that you can and can't say or really have to tiptoe around saying, and that's just been an interesting experience for me. So talking about, when somebody expresses that they're very ready to die, we can present medical aid in dying laws as an option for them to pursue, but we can in no way make it seem as though we are telling them to do that, counseling them to do so, etc. So in relation to this case, which doesn't have much to do with medical aid in dying, I'm just thinking about really how do we know what's normal for somebody who's dying and preparing to die to say, and when is it suicidal? When is it dangerous? When do we need to talk about MAID? So there's just a lot of those gray areas in hospice work and in this case too. And then third, am I competent enough as an intern to make this determination? I've been lucky enough to have my own independent caseload and be able to really grow as an independent social worker through this internship. But at the same time, some conversations that I have specifically with this client leave me wondering, leave me feeling like I need to ask somebody for their opinion or for what to do next, etc., and not as independent. So information about the patient: she's 103 years old, meaning she was born in 1916, which still really blows my mind. When I open her chart and I see 1916, she was admitted in October of 2018, so I've been following her since admission, and she lives in an independent living facility, which is basically just an apartment complex for older adults. You don't get any of the benefits that the assisted living or skilled nursing would receive. She has family that lives in the area in Boulder and Golden, and her husband passed 30 years ago, which again is just so crazy to me because she's been a widow longer than I've been alive. And also she talks about how he retired in 1968. And that is it just blows my mind how long this woman has been alive. So she has expressed since the beginning that she's ready to die, that she's lived a full life. She's traveled the world. Her husband was in the military, so she had the opportunity to see Europe and Asia in the 40s, 50s, and 60s. And she says specifically that she's just ready for old man death to come and take her. She, especially over the last probably 6 weeks, she's definitely noticed her decline, her cognitive decline, and that's really frustrating to her. I guess her physical decline too, but cognitively it's a lot more difficult for her because even at admission, she's super sharp, could tell us very detailed stories about her life, and that has tapered down since she was admitted. An interesting part about her history is that she mentioned that she was a part of the Church of Scientology at some point in her younger life, now just describes herself as Christian, but wouldn't really go into a lot of detail about that, and that's not a conversation that I feel comfortable, especially as a social worker and not a chaplain, but even a chaplain doesn't feel totally comfortable, poking at, no, tell me your exact religious history if someone is not just open and willing from the start. During visits, the patient discusses that wishes she would just die in her sleep because she's tired all the time. I feel like that's understandable. Last thing, patient has a pacemaker and it can be turned off, but we don't know. It's a mixed bag on if it would hasten death or not, or if it would just leave her feeling worse because her cardiac function isn't as good. So that's just another medical thing to throw into the situation. So I'm going to first start with just my opinion of this case. I feel like she's struggling with death a lot because she's psychologically more ready to die, and she can express that so clearly, but her body is holding on, which leads me to believe that there's a part of her that's maybe in conflict that is still keeping her alive. A lot of times people need permission. They need to hear from their family members that they're going to be okay before they physically pass. So I'm wondering if there's something deeper underneath. So I'm going to focus here on a potential religious or spiritual conflict because it's a different theoretical lens than I've looked through before, and is something that I've really been diving into lately, looking at religion and death, as spirituality and death, and the relationships between those things. So the theoretical perspective that I'm looking at is spiritual sensitivity. And it's this woman, Buber, has this theory of dialogue, and it was inspired by a student that she had that committed suicide after the student had expressed to her, hey, I'm having issues. And then Buber was thinking about, I want to, she just fully devoted her life on how to engage in authentic dialogue as a form of spiritual connection. So this theory has two different parts: I-thou versus I-it communication. I-thou communication is spiritually sensitive, open, personal, responsive, affirming, builds relational depth, and is a form of dialogue. Whereas I-it communication is a technical dialogue. It's goal-driven, information gathering, subjective, and it's more of a monologue. So I-thou is more about relationship building and the process of appreciating differences, seeing extraordinary in the ordinary, being authentic, being responsive, and expressing love to another. This also doesn't mean that I-it communication is bad. There's just a time and place when you need to get answers about things versus when you can really have a discussion and open your heart and your mind. So for more case analysis, I read this paper/book by this woman named Mary Callahan, and she connects this theory with I-thou communication has when a social worker engages in I-thou communication with an individual who is approaching death, they can forge a spiritual connection, and the individual can resolve this spiritual conflict by just having a spiritual connection with someone near end of life. This makes me think about, is a social worker competent enough to provide this type of care, especially when we have chaplains who have their masters in divinity and spirituality, religion is really, really what they focus on, when as social worker, not so much. We understand the importance, but it's not our focus of study. And then another question is, what if the patient rejects chaplain visits? My patient here, she does not want to see a chaplain. She just says she doesn't need any spiritual support, although it seems like it. And obviously, we're not going to force anything on her. But does that still leave me competent enough to be counseling her and talking with her? So the interventions that we are implementing now is that I visit the patient every other week, and I allow lots of time for visits so that I'm not rushed. I can really engage with her and have that I-thou bond and communication where we're able to just sit and chat about whatever comes up and spend time there. Usually a visit will be around 30 minutes to an hour, and I always leave about 2 hours. If we use all that time, great. If we don't, then that's fine too. I've offered chaplain visits, and again, she has declined them. And then there's a challenge of measuring this intervention to know if it's effective or not, because the patient is dying. She's actively losing cognitive and physical functioning. So can it really be measured? Like, can these types of interventions really be measured in hospice patients when like their brains are starting to shut down and they're not working as well? That's just a big picture question that I have. So my discussion questions for you guys is, do you know anything about the Church of Scientology's relationship with death and dying? If you do, I would love to hear it. That could be really helpful. Another question is, how do we stay unbiased as social workers when religions such as Scientology have significant negative press? You hear all the time about how the Church of Scientology brainwashes and is about child abuse, etc. So how do we stay unbiased in our work with a client who might have belonged to a controversial group or religion at some point in their life? Do you see anything else in this case with the brief history that I gave you, that could be causing an end-of-life conflict for her? Is there unresolved trauma from witnessing wars in her life? Maybe her husband had PTSD. I have no idea. Do you see anything or think of anything that sticks out? And then lastly, do you believe that increasing social work visit frequency and time is a sufficient intervention? And even if we don't talk about religion or spirituality, a lot of times we just talk about how she's ready to die, or we'll talk about the weather or the holidays, or she asks about my schooling a lot. So do you believe that is still a sufficient and positive intervention for the patient? Do you think it's a good idea? And if you have other ideas, absolutely, please let me know. Thank you guys for listening, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.